please. Meeting number 81, the Standing Committee on Finance, our pre-budget consultations 2012.
My name is Awad and I am the National Chairperson for the Canadian Federation of Students. The Canadian Federation of Students is Canada's largest and oldest national students' organization, representing more than 600,000 students in all 10 provinces. Our organization advocates for an accessible, affordable, high-quality public post-secondary education system. Our budget recommendations focus on how to make education more affordable for students and address mounting student debt in Canada. Ensuring that all people in the country are able to pursue a higher education and training must be part of any significant, stable, long-term recovery for our economy. Relatively high youth unemployment, record levels of personal debt, low levels of industry research and innovation, and a rapidly growing income gap all compound the problems of the global financial crash and subsequent recession and must be addressed. In its most recent Global Economic Competitiveness Report, the World Economic Forum ranked Canada 15th in ability to compete economically with other countries around the world, down from 12th last year and 8th the year before. This is a worrying trend. In its explanation, the Forum noted that Canada's disjointed and inefficient post-secondary education system was one of the main reasons for this slide. The OECD has also highlighted that participation rates will have to grow significantly if Canada is going to address changing labor market demands, and an aging workforce. Unfortunately, the cost of post-secondary education continues to be downloaded onto students and their families, despite the significant public rate of return on investments in post-secondary education. Every dollar invested into post-secondary brings in $1.63 in return. It's a 63% return on that investment. As a result of high tuition fees, student debt has increased substantially. Average public student debt is now over $27,000 after an undergraduate degree alone. Paired with rising tuition fees, it's easy to understand how we've arrived at a situation where Canadians collectively owe $15 billion to the federal government alone, not including the billions more that they owe to provincial and private loans. Credit agencies and major banks are now warning that student debt has reached unstable levels. The long-term impacts of carrying such debt include delayed participation in the economy, the inability to invest or save for retirement, choosing to move out of the country in order to find work, starting a family later in life, and the aversion of taking on further financial risks like starting a business. Those in finance have finally caught on to what students have been saying for years, that debt is an issue and it's not going away. Today, over 25% of the Canada student loan borrowers are on the government's repayment assistance program, meaning that they do not make enough money to make their monthly loan payments. Over 147,000 Canadians are currently unable to make any payments on their loans from month to month. In conditions like these, how could we possibly expect students and graduates to participate fully in the economy? Students are putting forward a vision that would work to address the root cause of the debt crisis and address the debt itself. First, the government should implement a federal post-secondary education act modeled on the Canada Health Act and create a dedicated cash transfer for post-secondary education. Provincial governments must be accountable for the transfers they receive from the federal government, and an act would ensure that federal funding to the provinces for post-secondary education would actually be spent on just that. The lack of a national vision has resulted in significant disparity in tuition fee levels and per-student funding across the country, with students in Ontario paying almost 3 times more than students in Newfoundland and Labrador, and students in Alberta receiving almost double the rate of per-student funding than those in Quebec. Students are calling on the government to ensure that merit, and not geography, determines whether someone can go to college or university. The government also needs to address the historic underfunding of post-secondary education that results from the cuts to federal transfers in the late 1990s. By filling the gap left by 2 decades of inadequate funding, the federal government could take action to reduce high tuition fees, which are the heart of the student debt crisis. We're also recommending that, in order to stop the federal student loan debt from increasing, government redirect the $2.52 billion currently allocated in ineffective education tax credits and savings schemes into the Canada Student Grants Program. This simple solution would remove the need for the $2.3 billion the Canada Student Loans Program gives out every year, and such a change would have a significant impact on students' ability to both get an education in the short term and our ability to contribute meaningfully to Canada's economy and society in the long term. In order to address the existing debt, we recommend reducing student debt by half, bringing it down from $15 billion outstanding to $7.5 billion by 2015. By consulting with the provinces and national stakeholders, the government would be able to effectively distribute this debt relief to have the greatest measurable impact. I certainly appreciate the opportunity to address the committee this evening. 5 minutes is not quite enough time to do all of the recommendations justice, which are included in the book that was handed out, Public Education for the Public Good. But I'm more than happy to answer any questions should members have any.
I just want to thank all the witnesses for being here. And some of you had very similar comments. Many of you spoke about R&D and innovation. You spoke about labor shortages. You spoke about debt, both government debt and personal debt. And I'd maybe like to start with you, Mr. Awad. You have a proposal to help alleviate student debt. Can you tell me, from the perspective of students, what would the role of reducing student debt play in helping with economic development? Are there overall economic advantages to Canadians for reducing the debt, particularly students?
Absolutely. And so I had made reference to this in my remarks that what we're seeing more and more is, particularly with high youth unemployment, it's double the rate of the general rate of unemployment at the moment, that youth are having, particularly graduates, are having a harder time finding employment right afterwards, so it makes it difficult to repay that amount. But we also see lower levels of youth entrepreneurship, because if you graduate with $25,000, $35,000, $40,000 in debt, then taking on an additional debt for the bank loan in order to start a business is often way too much in terms of actually being able to pay that all back. And so when we see the rising number of students using the repayment assistance program as part of the Canada Student Loans Program, that means that there are, this year 147,000 people for which the federal government is covering their interest. And it means that they aren't able to invest locally in their economy, they aren't able to put money away for economic stability, they aren't able to often start families because that requires greater resources. And so by actively reducing the debt, it would alleviate a number of those issues and would provide students an opportunity to reinvest in their local economy, to be creative and to start their own industries, to start their own businesses, and would allow people to actually be able to plan much further ahead rather than from week to week, from paycheck to paycheck.
Okay, thank you very much. And I noticed in your report you also raised the issue of Aboriginal youth, and it was mentioned by you, Mr. Gratton, and I know, Mr. Everson, you mentioned the whole issue of labor shortage. As I understand it, there's going to be about 300,000 Aboriginal youth joining or potentially joining the labor market over the next 15 years. So, Mr. Gratton, I'd like to start with you. What is the mining sector doing to outreach to Aboriginal youth to address the skills shortage and to bring those youth into the labor market? Thanks very much. Anyone else want to talk about Aboriginal youth? Anybody else? I've got like 20 seconds.
Yes, so a number of things. I think in our report we do highlight this, that the Centre for the Study of Living Standards highlighted that if the Aboriginal communities in Canada participated at the same rate as non-Aboriginal communities in post-secondary education, over 20 years we would see a return on investment of $400 billion pumped into the economy, and that's because Aboriginal people are the fastest growing demographic in Canada. The federal...
Mr. Awad, I'm sorry, I'm out of time, but I'm going to read your report and find out more about that. Thank you. Or maybe someone else will ask you.
Mr. Paquette, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to the witnesses for appearing. I'm just going to ask a quick question to the Chamber of Commerce and to the Canadian Federation of Students, because I think you guys were saying the same thing. Mr. Everson, you were saying that government's not moving when it comes to innovation, and it's got to do a bit better job. And Mr. Awad, you were saying that Canada does not have the ability to compete. Canada is not competing, and we see it in the statistics. So are you both saying the same thing, or am I misinterpreting what is being said?
So what we're actually seeing is Canada's, compared to other industrialized developed countries, Canada ranks quite low in terms of private sector spending on research and innovation. And so what we're seeing is people are trained in universities, they go through their master's to PhD, they often have private-public partnerships for their research projects while they're in school, often funded through federal programs, and then they graduate and aren't able to find jobs because the companies that gave them the research funding while they were in school didn't continue that up with doing their own in-house research, and that's what we're seeing is the major issue. And so there's two tables in particular that I would draw attention to for the members of the committee on page 16 of the document. One that highlights that Canada is the single largest, or offers, compared to other countries around the world, some of the largest business incentives for research and innovation, but doesn't actually produce the same amount of private sector research
So
as other
what role does the
countries.
government have to, what does the government have to, or what can this committee recommend to have, government change what it's doing so that it works?
Well, often what we see is research institutions rely more heavily on private funding for research because they don't actually receive enough core funding to operate research on their own, so they're forced to turn to other sources to make that happen. And business incentives that come from the government to encourage those private-public partnerships simply make it worse because it's easier for a private corporation to get a graduate student, which is much cheaper to do the research, than to pay them a full salary and benefits once they graduate.
Yeah, just, you said that if the three Ps is actually a hindrance because it doesn't motivate the the private industry, the public to work together. Can you just expand on that?
Yeah, just very briefly, sir.
Yep. So what happens is public funding is provided to these research projects if companies will invest a certain portion, but we're not seeing a continued investment in their own in-house research once that project is done. So students actually have no access to jobs once they finish their education and their training.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Paquette.
We know there's a lot of issues right now. We know about the fact that employment is double in terms of actually the rate of unemployment. We know in terms of even Canadians are having a lot of problems with household debts. And we can imagine what it would be like to start your career with a huge student loan or debt. Can you tell us and give us a feel of how it's been going maybe for the past 6 years? Has it been better? Has it been worse in terms of students?
In terms of student debt?
Yeah.
So we work with the numbers produced by the Canada Student Loans Program, and year over year we see that there are more applications, there are more loans given out, and that overall students are relying more and more not just on provincial and federal loans that already exist, but they're turning to credit cards to pay for rent, for groceries, they're turning to student lines of credit, and for any student who's in a particular place where public loans aren't enough for whatever program they're in, then they have to turn to a full-on student line of credit up to $30,000 or $40,000 in some cases, just to make ends meet. And we're seeing that trend is getting worse.
So would you say that the students now feel worse than maybe 6 years ago?
Time.
Yes.
I certainly appreciate your thoughts in terms of tax credits being reconfigured into the student grant program, but I do have a lot of concerns that there would be significant unintended consequences. And I don't know if you've analyzed the potential impact. So for example, 60% of the students graduate without debt. Some of them are doing co-op programs and they count on that tax credit to keep them not paying taxes. So I guess my concern and strong belief is that there would be a whole lot of people that are just maybe struggling to make sure their children graduate without debt, and I'd really like some analysis of that tax credit system, and because I think we would have a lot of problems in terms of unintended consequences.
Mr. Awad, if you want to address it briefly, and then you can follow up with the committee as well.
So we're certainly not recommending that any kind of snap movement be made, so that the people who do fall into that category aren't negatively affected, but more determining the actual mechanism for grandfathering out the people who are currently benefiting from those programs, and finding a way to shift that so that anyone who comes into the system who newly comes into the system would instead benefit from that money coming up front in the form of grants. But we can certainly follow up once this wraps up.
We're really